I want to welcome everybody to the Ventech event tonight, featuring Fast Pitch and a panel on generative AI. We're really excited about this. Thank you all for coming. Our Fast Pitch event tonight, we have two amazing entrepreneurs that we are really excited about. Just a little bit about Fast Pitch. Fast Pitch supports two of our core goals here at Ventech. The first one is innovation. This is our opportunity to showcase novel, new, and exciting technologies born here in the Santa Barbara area. And sometimes it's going to be some of the first people that get to see it is you guys, and the opportunity to engage with these brands. So we're really excited about that. The second core value is community. Ventech is about bringing like-minded people together, like all of us, celebrating and engaging in technologies and products and services that, again, are innovative, groundbreaking, and homegrown. It's very exciting. So we have two great companies tonight. First up, we have Joe Fleming of Bioprotonics, and on deck is Vanessa Royal of Tilden. I'm not going to do any introductions because they are very capable in doing that themselves. So Joe, come on up.
It's a pleasure being here today. My name is Joe Fleming. I'm representing Bioprotonics, and I'm very excited to unveil groundbreaking new technology in the MRI space that can be less invasive and lower cost alternative to surgical biopsy. For the first time ever, we've discovered a new way to measure tissue architecture at the micro level using an existing MRI device to discover and diagnose stage and type of cancer. All right, MRI is becoming the gold standard of diagnostic imaging. A big limitation with MRI today is the inability to image tissue below 1 millimeter. There's not enough image and there's not enough resolution in the image. So currently the standard of care is to receive a surgical biopsy to have the tissue analyzed in the lab. And not only is that costly a procedure, but it's very invasive, some would say barbaric, and it also has its own inaccuracies and risks. Let me introduce you to the Bioprotonics solution. It's called magnetic resonance histopathology, or MRH for short. The patented MRH platform, which is a proprietary software-only MRI sequence that provides quantitative measurements of tissue during a standard MRI scan. As you see in the illustration, we can differentiate between healthy tissue from tumor tissue in the 10 micron to 1 millimeter range. This slide shows how MRH correlates with the ground truth, traditionally the histopathology methods, from biopsy tissue under a microscope. I want to reiterate, we are not doing any post-processing software or taking on or ingesting any existing MRI data. This is not enhancing images or improving voxel resolution. This is a unique proprietary MRI sequence that generates novel data of the tissue at a micro level in the form of an MRH signal that we can analyze to diagnose the stage and type of cancer, similar results you get from a surgical biopsy. We've tested this MRH 1.0 on IRB in March with the first live patients and demonstrated clear tissue differentiation in the prostate of different patients. In the slide, you can see each square represents a volume analogous to a biopsy sample that you can see in the color-coded scoring of each volume. In the slide you see here, the MRH spectroscopy, the spectrum, you can see of the cancer in blue versus the non-cancer in white. Our MRH technology will enhance existing MRI diagnostics in the market. We have a high confidence that MRH can be applied to many different pathologies and disease diagnostics. However, our focus is the prostate because it's the leading cancer in males and because there's a high false negative result, roughly 40% from biopsies. The biopsy market's very large. In the US alone, there's about 1 million biopsies performed for prostate, and the reimbursement is around 2 to 3 grand. So it's a 2 to 3 billion market. Our customer feedback is phenomenal. We've had collaborated with distinguished radiologists from and different MRI companies. We've collaborated with Dr. Gary Gold, the chair of radiology at Stanford, and collaborated on, and we've also collaborated with other companies such as Ragnet on that we have a development agreement with them or a research agreement And they're one of the largest MRI clinics in the country. And they're going to be doing our clinical trials and roll out our technology during the commercial phase. Year to date, we've raised about $2.3 million and have accomplished quite a bit. Moving forward, Philips is going to be signing a development agreement with us in the next, later this year or early next year. We plan to raise our next round next year, which will complete the MRH 2.0 version, complete our large clinical trial, secure FDA clearance, and roll out the technology commercially, unless we get acquired before then. We have an experienced medtech team. Our founder, Tim Janes, has over 30 years experience in MR research. Myself and our CEO, Forrest Fleming, had a successful exit with True Vision Surgical. Our business model is a three-tier licensing model. The first is a co-development with the co-development of MRH to be compatible with the MRI manufacturers. The second is a license per system per year with the MRH manufacturers. And then the third is an application license to per machine per year to hospitals and imaging centers. So we plan to have a three-tier different business model and different revenue streams there. Hopefully, we're expecting early revenue late next year, and then the following year be profitable. So I know it's a lot of information to digest in 5 minutes, but please come talk to me if you're interested in the technology or an investment opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Vanessa Royal and I'm the co-founder of Tilden. I'm really excited to be here tonight, not only because this was actually my wedding venue, but because I'm thrilled to tell you that whether you know it or not, more and more people are drinking less and less alcohol. 42% of drinking age Gen Z has actually never had alcohol. So that's those between the ages of 21 and 27, which was certainly not my college experience. And of all publications, Vice magazine has actually declared that alcohol is over. Even big players like Diageo have built out investment arms that are focused on finding non-alcoholic brands that are going to shepherd this new wave forward. My co-founder and I personally felt this movement swelling while we were students at Harvard Business School. We came from very different drinking backgrounds. She is a lifelong teetotaler from Las Vegas, while I am 3 years sober, having quit drinking here in Santa Barbara during COVID lockdown. We really bonded over a shared frustration that we felt when we were at networking events and dinner parties in business school, where there were only sodas or sort of childish sugary options available to us while our friends and professors drank nice scotches and wines. So we really spent the next 2 years refining what we felt like was missing from the non-alc space, and we arrived at 4 key components to a great non-alcoholic cocktail. Those were a complex flavor journey, so when you have a great cocktail, you have a beginning, middle, and finish. We needed those in non-alc. We have that interrupter that makes you sip and swirl, not chug it down. We wanted elevated, all-natural ingredients without a ton of sugar or preservatives. And finally, we wanted it to be worthy of a great presentation, so something you could have at a nice adult evening. So how big is this opportunity? So beverage is obviously a behemoth industry, and if you don't know, non-alc is actually one of the fastest growing segments within beverage, even faster than tequila and mezcal, which is quite surprising. But we estimate our TAM to be about 23 million and expect growth year over year. So I'm thrilled to introduce you to Tilden. There are samples out front. These are complex, delicious, and ready to drink, and we've really brought non-alc to a new level as we have entered the market. Since launching these first 2 expressions, we've won a number of awards, including Best in Show Non-Alc Cocktail and Platinum at the LA Spirit Awards, as well as Gold at the World Alcohol Free Awards. Our lace wing, which is on the left, features cucumber, basil, and lychee over a juniper berry lemongrass base, and it has a finish of cayenne and Szechuan pepper for mouthfeel and finish. And then our tandem on the right is my favorite as a former whiskey gal who, loves a smoky drink. So this is a orange tart, cherry, and ginger, and it has a trio of American oak, lapsang, and rooibos for that smoky finish. It's really great warmed up with cinnamon. These 2 flavors are flying off shelves. And actually, we sold out our pre-order this past December, which was online, as well as our first launch in February, and garnered a ton of free press across publications like USA Today, Brides, and Huffington Post. We also got a ton of social shares as people are, turning away from alcohol, and we've not spent a single dollar on ads or influencers so far. Since launching in February, we've placed Tilden on shelves and on bar menus across Santa Barbara, where obviously we are, Boston, where my co-founder is, and New York City. We have a 95% reorder rate across these accounts, really showing us that we are, number one, targeting the right accounts, and number two, the product is really resonating with consumers. So you'll notice a lot of local places around here, and we're also chatting with Rosewood, Lazy Acres, and the Santa Barbara Film Festival. And we've achieved all this with just a team of 3 full-time employees. I have a background in PR and communications, having worked at tech unicorn Cloudflare. My co-founder, Mariah, has deep supply chain management and operations experience. And we recently hired our first employee, Barry, who has about 10 years of experience across alcohol and beverage. And we're not doing this alone. We've pulled together an amazing advisory board of folks who have huge experience across beverage, retail, D2C, and scaling for multinational corporations, as well as startups and generation-defining brands. So last year, we raised an oversubscribed round from friends and family to get us through our first 4 production runs. We have about 6 months of runway, and we are now raising our pre-seed round, really looking for folks who are interested in what we're doing. So if you know of anybody or you want to chat, please come say hi after. We plan to use this money over the next 12 to 18 months to build out our sales and marketing capabilities and focus on trialability. Thank you so much for your time. Please come chat with me after the sessions, grab some samples, pour them over ice, and enjoy. Cheers.
Amazing. And again, if you are interested in doing a fast pitch or you know a company that is up and coming, looking for funding, looking for talent, we've had Fast Pitch just come and look for talent. They've got the funding. They're trying to scale. Any of those things, looking for, of course, great companies to present to you guys in the future. Okay, so now on with the show. I'd like to introduce to you Marco Pinto, and he will, did I say that right? Marco Pinter, and he will be introducing our panel tonight. Marco?
So I'm really happy to see the crowd we have today, which is sort of like the attendance we had pre-pandemic. That's wonderful to see. And I think a big part of that is the interest and, really profound changes that are happening due to generative AI that we're all interested in and want to learn more about. And to sort of emphasize that to start, the title of today's panel and the description you read were both generated by ChatGPT. So I know all these 3 gentlemen from different walks of life: volunteer, education, and industry. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but first, just as an introduction to the whole evening, I'm going to ask Matthew to sort of define generative AI for us and how it differs from other types of AI, machine learning, deep learning. Give us a little lens into that.
Okay. Actually, may I indulge the audience and ask the audience a few questions first? How many of you are, like, primarily in your day-to-day work life, technical people working on AI-related things? Can you let me know? Okay, quite a few, but less than half, I would say. I'm also curious, a year ago, I think the title of this panel would have not attracted this many people. Something happened in November 11 months ago. Anybody know what that is that sort of brought this to the attention of the world? Okay, great. So you're an educated audience. That's super. All right, so AI is basically software that does things that if a human did it, you'd call it intelligent. And there are like 100 different definitions, but something like that. Creating agents that do things that are autonomous, that are not simple. There are all kinds of ways of defining AI, but it's a broad discipline that can bring in psychology and software and hardware and all kinds of things, but it's this general idea of building smart software, basically, right? Machine learning is, in some versions of the ontology of the world, a subset of AI, and it's creating learning AI, or models that learn things specifically. And in some cases, it's just models that learn a dividing barrier between cats and dogs, or between cancer and not cancer, or whatever the problem might be. Or maybe the set of boundaries between Chevrolet and Ford and Ferrari and whatever. So it could be all kinds of things like that. Or a model that predicts the level of whatever, some chemical in your body or something based on various measurements. So all kinds of things like that. Deep learning, which I guess we'll talk about at various times today, or deep networks, or deep learning, is basically neural networks and large neural networks. Not these really small ones that people did for a long time, but ones with many layers, many nodes, and typically these days, billions of parameters trained on huge amounts of data. And then generative AI, in my view, and by the way, you guys please correct me after this. Generative AI is sort of a subset of most of these things, and it's really AI, machine learning based AI, that can create new, novel text, images, multimedia, models, plans, you name it. Anything that you can actually model, generative AI might be able to create new versions of that. And of course, the one we all know mostly, or the whole world mostly knows, is ChatGPT and various things like that, large language models. These are huge, deep network models that can produce novel language. Things that ChatGPT produces are not just copying things from its data and regurgitating it. Maybe it can do that, but it can specifically create new phrases and words and paragraphs and stories that are not in its data. And then same thing with images, same thing with audio, same thing with other kinds of sound, same thing with architecture, with design, all kinds of things. So generative AI creates things. And last comment is, in AI in general, before generative AI became popular, there's this long distinction between discriminative models, which are basically like the barriers I mentioned before. Is it on this side of the barrier or that side of the barrier? Is it a cat or is it a dog? And generative models, which say, I want to figure out the parameters that produce the model of the dog, for example. And it's that sort of second kind of model that's at the core of generative AI. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Matthew. Am I still on? For framing the topic for us, and I learned some new things from that as well. So I'd like to go to introductions now, even though I did it a little out of order, deliberately. So I'm Marco Pinter, the moderator, and I'm on the Ventech board, so I'm co-hosting the event. And I'm also the founder of an early stage startup in the area of digital mental wellness through creative arts. And I am a consumer of generative AI, and I have used ChatGPT and Midjourney extensively in building this startup in its early stages. I'll have some thoughts later on this topic of whether we are losing jobs or gaining jobs through generative AI. I'll wait until we get to that. But in the meantime, yes, let's hear from all of our panel. What is your background, and then how are you using generative AI today within that? So Phil Carpenter, let's start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Phil Carpenter, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of a company called Alice Technologies. People are like, Alice, what's Alice? It's an acronym. Artificial Intelligence Construction Engineering is where that came from. Sprang out of the work that our founder, Ray Morcos, did when he was a PhD student at Stanford in construction engineering. He is a lifetime civil engineer and was applying artificial intelligence to a very specific problem in construction, which is the problem of construction scheduling. And that's where Alice focuses. If you think about building a very large, very complex construction project, think bridges, highway, 50-story office tower. As you can imagine, that's a very, very complicated task. And you could do many of the elements in that process in different orders. You could do A and then B and then C. You could do A and then C and then B. Some things have to stay. You got to build the second floor before you build the third floor. But in general, there's a lot of room for variation. So what Alice does is create many, many different possible ways to build. That's the generative piece, right? So Matthew was talking about the different things that AI could create. In our case, it's a construction schedule, or frankly, schedules. And then we allow people to do what we call optioneering, which is kind of the fun part. It's the experimentation where they can run what-if analysis. They can play with the model and say, you know what if we ran 3 of those giant cranes that you see all over our skyscrapers today? What if we ran 3 cranes instead of 2 on the site? Could we build faster? Could we build cheaper? Would we be more likely to deliver our project on time? What if we ran a second framing crew for a week? You know, would we be more likely to hit the budget? What if COVID? How do we adapt to that, right? And AI is perfect for exploring those options in scheduling and helping you to solve some of those questions and ultimately making smart business decisions. So many projects, as you guys know, they run over budget, they run over schedule. AI can help solve that problem, and it's a big, expensive problem.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to jump across to Sushil next, and I want to frame in terms of Ventech as well. I used to work with Sushil at InTouch Health, and then we were bought by Teladoc. The founder of InTouch, Yuan Wang, has spoken here many times. When we were acquired, then I hosted Joe DeVivo, our CEO, to talk about that acquisition, which was one of the largest in Santa Barbara history. So yes, there's a long legacy here of InTouch people. So Sushil, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Marco. Hey everyone, good evening. I'm Sushil. I come all the way from Nepal. That's where I grew up as a child. And then what drove me to US is the education. So I did my master's in Kansas. So that's where I spent my 2 years, diving into the realms of AI. And back then, generative AI was not even a thing, but generative term was there. But anyway, doing all kind of AI and computer vision and deep learning stuff. And then I went to DC to do some startups for a while, and then I was not happy. And then I came all the way to Santa Barbara. But I did my internship at InTouch Health, which Marco just mentioned. So my background is kind of like, I have electronics and communication engineering degree. That's what I did for my bachelor's degree. That's how I started. But then when I was doing electronics, and then I kind of shifted my gears towards robotics. That's where I was for most of my time in my career. But when I was building these robots, what I felt was, you program from A to B and that's it. Or you do, one task, you just program it for one particular task, and that's what it does for 24/7, right? And I thought it was kind of dumb. And I wanted to kind of understand, like, how can I empower this poor, robot with some kind of knowledge or intelligence? And that's where I was kind of exploring, and that's where I got, into machine learning and deep learning. And back then, very few of us had heard about AI, artificial intelligence, or deep learning. But now I think since ChatGPT was launched, I think we know a lot about AI. That's my academic career kind of thing. I work currently as a senior machine learning engineer at Teladoc Health. I'm not sure how many of us in the room have heard of Teladoc Health, but there are different, I'd say, different parts of the Teladoc Health we must have heard, like BetterHelp is one of them. Livongo, which is our chronic diabetes management program, that's another. So what drove me into the healthcare industry all the way from electronics, communication, robotics is the intersection of AI with healthcare and to serve the people and the whole person care. I think that's what kind of drove me automatically into the healthcare space, and that's where I spend most of my time these days. Over to you, Marco.
Great. And then back to you, Matthew. So of course I know you through UCSB, where you were chair of computer science, and the program I was in for a PhD, you may have been instrumental in me being accepted to that program. I'm not sure. So why don't you give a little bit of background on yourself?
We actually did let you graduate? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, my name is Matthew Turk. I am currently the president of the Toyota Technological Institute at Chicago, or TTIC, which in fact is located in Chicago, surprise. I moved there and took that position about a little over 4 years ago after being in Santa Barbara for 19 years at UCSB and in computer science and media arts and technology. I have worked, well, before that I was at Microsoft Research up in Seattle in its early days, and before that I worked in an aerospace company doing autonomous vehicles back way before autonomous vehicles were cool. So I've done a lot of things in robotics and in computer vision and in machine learning and in human-computer interaction. Augmented reality, did a startup around 2016, I think, in AR. And so right now I do a lot of administration, frankly, because I have to deal with, you know, HR and the board and all that fun stuff. But I still get to do research and focus largely on computer vision and related things. But I've actually had various experiences over the past, I don't know, 6 to 8 years about ethics and legal issues in, you know, related to AI technologies, computer vision, face recognition. Actually, my PhD thesis was on face recognition, one of the relatively early works on it. And it's been kind of interesting to see the evolution of that and sort of a lot of the issues associated with it that have come about in more recent years. So I think the ethical and legal and policy issues related with generative AI, which I assume we're going to be talking about, some of those are really important, and I spend a good amount of time thinking about those these days.
Great. Yes, we're definitely going to find our way there. But to start, Sushil, so you work in healthcare and actively in generative AI from an engineering perspective. Where do you see generative AI being used today and in the future in healthcare?
Generative AI in healthcare has its many applications. For example, like you can use, I mean, there are no industries where generative AI is not usable in some or the other way. We can talk about ethical implications and, you know, legislations and so forth later. But what I see, as at least in the healthcare, is that there are a lot of use cases. For example, we see a lot of burnouts among our physicians and doctors, right? Because they would have to, once the visit is over, they would have to write this long, you know, summary, and then they would have to put all those ICD codes and whatnot into the computers, right? Once the visits are done. So that's where you can use the generative capabilities to kind of like listen. So it could be multi-modal, right? So you can use the generative AI to listen to these conversations that happen between the physician and a patient, and then try to fill in those blanks, whatever the doctor needs to do, automatically or in some human-in-the-loop kind of feedback kind of you know, pipeline. So that is one use cases I could, one of many use cases I could see. So that saves doctors time, and then so then he or she can focus on the other part, other patients, right? So that's one. I think that is related to generating the SOAP notes. So that's what I was talking about. Let's see. There are other multiple kind of use cases in the hospitals section where you can use these generative AI capabilities to kind of, come up with more training examples, for example, right? There are lots of limited hospital clinical data, and one of the pros and the cons, we can judge it, but one of the major challenges in the hospital and the clinical settings is that we have very limited amount of data set to train these huge models, right? So I've seen a couple of companies who have been using these generative AI capabilities to generate these training examples and feed into these algorithms or the ML models and train them. So yeah, at least that's what I can think of.
Yeah, thank you. And Phil, so you talked to us about using generative AI for scheduling at Alice, and then including simulations of various situations that you imagine. Now, you've let me know construction is a $12 trillion industry. So where else in the industry do you see generative AI coming into play?
I think there's so many other pieces of the construction world that will soon benefit from the application of AI. One that's already getting traction, it's looking at basically progress versus plan, right? So you've got a model, you've got a plan that shows you what are we trying to build, and it's often hard for the people on the ground to have an understanding of where they truly stand versus that original plan. So now there are technologies where they're mounting cameras on cranes that are overhead, or even on cameras. So as people are scooting around the job site, the cameras are on their hard hats. Taking imagery all the time, the AI ingests that, compares that against the original model, and helps them understand how far they are, right? Or if they're veering off course in certain ways, it helps them to ascertain how. There's also the build itself, and really interesting applications that combine AI with robotics, right? So now there are robots that are installing drywall, fast, efficient, non-union labor, nobody's complaining, right? It's like, it's easy, it's extraordinary. Or there are fusions of big pieces of construction machinery, like ditch diggers, for example, with AI, such that they now know if they need to build a trench to lay a pipe, that they can do it, and they know how to sort of adapt if they need to make changes along the way. So look, our little world is just that. It's little, it's scheduling, and there are so many other use cases within our segment alone.
Yeah, thank you. I want to get into, for a little while, large language models like ChatGPT, since, as we heard and know, ChatGPT has kind of changed the landscape here. So I'm going to ask a couple folks about that in different contexts, and, what are we gaining from that, and what are the dangers of that? And I want to start in academia, and just to let you know, Sushil, I'm going to hit that up in healthcare too. But first, Matthew, yes, so you run this institution, you used to be at UCSB. Obviously, we know ChatGPT is an issue with students, and where do you see the problems and benefits, and where is that going?
Ooh, jumping to that already, huh? Yeah, so any new technology is disruptive. I think that's sort of a starting point for discussion like this. And these technologies, AI in general and generative AI in particular, are beginning to be, and I believe are going to continue to be, very, very disruptive in lots of ways. And so how we are going to adapt to that disruption causes pain and causes a lot of adaptation. And not everything will be great in every aspect along the way. And so people have been trying to figure out just in the last 11 months how to sort of get in front of the students in the education scenarios who are using ChatGPT to cheat, basically, right? And there's sort of different ways to think about this. One is just sort of a a cat and mouse kind of game. Someone starts to do something you don't like, and then you find a way to stop it, but then they find a way around it, and then you find a way to stop that, and there's another way around it. It's never ending, right? I think in the long run, at least after some pain and some shaking out, we will decide that these tools are great tools, and there's no reason to not have people use these tools when they can. And we will figure out ways to educate when people are using these tools. How exactly? I don't know right now, and nobody knows for sure right now. We'll kind of figure it out over time. So it's causing problems in the short run for sure, but I think it will, in this particular space, it will benefit education and benefit the population in general in the long run when we figure out better ways to deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. So turning then the lens on healthcare, and in terms of patients having dialogues with an AI about what's going on with them, what treatment they should get, and concerns about how the AI is getting trained and potential bias, where do you see that today and where it's going, Sushil?
Yeah. In the healthcare industry, what I have observed is that the use of generative AI is currently pretty limited. That's what I would say. That's my take on it. The reason behind is if we fail to deliver quality healthcare, or if it starts falsifying information, then the consequences are heavy, right? You can't expect generative AI to produce or generate facts every time. There is no any internal mechanism within the generative AI yet to automatically go and fact check. There are plugins, Bing.com, which is Bing Chat, powered by Microsoft GPT models. They have built-in plugins, and so has the ChatGPT framework. But those plugins are, again, limited to certain, certain capabilities. So to me, as of now, the use is limited. But being that said, how do we regulate that? How do we adapt to that is up to us and to those who makes the rules, right? So I think the diverse set of people should be in those communities where the rules are being made from and then implied upon in these generative AI. But like, for example, you cannot currently, there are multiple methods that we can go into that later, like implementing guardrails and blah, blah, blah. But those methods are will work only up to a certain extent. And I don't think, again, as I said, the consequences are pretty heavy. So the generative AI could be used, but in a very limited fashion. So that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you. So Ventech, we tend to have an audience of where a lot of us are in startups or running companies involved in local industry. As we need to build the talent, let's say in Santa Barbara, around deep learning and generative AI, this isn't Silicon Valley, so, do we have the talent here? How do we attract it? One thing I'll admit I don't know the very latest on, but a few years back, the word was to find people who could really implement deep learning, the PhDs in it, the salaries were insane, And I'm not sure if that's settled, but let me go to you, Phil. Where do you see sort of the local talent and your ability to hire for that?
Sure. So a little bit of background. So I come here from Silicon Valley. I moved to Santa Barbara a year ago, right? So I'm a relatively new arrival and have spent, most of my life and certainly my working life working in Silicon Valley, right? So I have a very Silicon Valley based orientation, and then an extraordinary new appreciation for Santa Barbara and what is here, right? So I'm still kind of getting to learn more about this community and and what's here and the talent base, right? So I will say that from what I observed in the Valley, yes, the compensation is sometimes insane, right? You've got somebody that's come out of, UCSB, UCSD, they've got a PhD, and they go to work for Google, and they're making like 200 grand in their first job, plus a bunch of options, and you're like, wow, how is that happening, right? This is a kid. So, and then it just, goes and goes from there. So the pay scales are different in the Valley. But look, the competition is also different in the Valley. There are fewer employers here, so fewer of us are struggling with each other for the talent. And also, I think people make choices, and there are so many aspects of life here that are attractive. If you look at why many of us are here, certainly me, it's not just for the work, right? I work for a company that is principally virtual. I could be anywhere, right? I'm here because I came to learn about Santa Barbara through my daughter, who was a student at UCSB. She exposed us first to the town, and we came to really know it and like it. And during COVID, ultimately came to realize that there was no reason for us to stay in the Bay. We could head south, and south we did. And we so appreciate being here, right? So, my story, I'm sure many of you could say similar things. So I think in that situation, you might make some trade-offs. You might say, hey, look, I'm willing to make less myself, or to pay people less, and they're willing to come here because they want to be here. So I think there's some flexibility there. But also, it is interesting, right? Because in this world that we now find ourselves working, where so much of the work is virtual, you have options that you wouldn't have before the COVID-inspired changes, right? You have access to talent anywhere, right? I mean, my company, half of the team is in Prague. It's a world away. And the rest of us are scattered all over the United States. And I'll tell you this, I don't need to pay Silicon Valley salaries to get extraordinarily smart people working on my business. So, things have changed. And even though in some places still, like Palo Alto, you're going to be paying way too much money for that PhD in AI, I can guarantee you, if you're willing to kind of free your mind a little bit and say, what if I looked in other places in the country and other places in the world, you're going to find some awfully smart people, and you're not going to break the bank to do it.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to, in a few minutes, I'm going to get back to jobs and maybe the darker side of generative AI and jobs. But first, I think we're all interested in sort of what's over the horizon, what's next, and sometimes we get a glimpse of that in academic research. So Matthew, you're running a research institution, so presumably there's multiple faculty with you who are working on generative AI, and so you're seeing where some of those research dollars are going, and maybe where you might have an idea of where they're going to be going in a year or two. So what are your thoughts about those areas?
Yeah, first two two quick comments. Lest you all think I'm crazy for leaving Santa Barbara after your passionate pitch there to go to Chicago, I still have my house here and I'm coming back at some point. So just wanted to make that for the record there. Yeah, this is still home. And the other thing was regarding talent and all that. I think probably all of you know this, but UC Santa Barbara has really great people in the area that we're talking about today who are attracting really good students. So as a community, continue to focus on and invest in UCSB, and that will really benefit the whole community. So, and I left UCSB grudgingly. I love UCSB, by the way. So what was the question again? Oh yeah, research. Boy, a long list. There's just so much to be done and so many things that people are looking into foundationally, application-wise and all. But I'll mention a few important things. One thing is that most of the progress and achievements and things you've heard about related to generative AI are practical achievements that are not at all grounded in theoretical knowledge. They are engineering feats and really impressive engineering feats, but we really don't know anything about them to some degree, at least deeply and foundationally. So there's a lot of work in the theory of machine learning applied in related areas that's trying to understand what are the limits, what can we not expect to be able to do? What can we definitely be able to do, definitely not be able to do? Questions like, how do you know how much data is enough when you're training a model, for planning your kinds of projects, right? And your small amount of data that you talked about, maybe it's enough, maybe it's not enough. How do you know that? Right now we know it basically because that's what those other people did and it seemed to work for them. There's a lot of that in this area. So having well theoretically grounded knowledge is still there's really very little of it. So there's a lot of machine learning theory basically that's asking a lot of questions like this. And then we'll maybe talk about data privacy and things like that later, but a question, these models are being trained on huge amounts of data. Where's that data coming from? Is it including, like all the emails I ever send? Is that in the training data for, some of these large language models? If so, might somebody actually produce my email in the future? Is that impossible or is it possible? How do we know? What are the constraints? They're very important, theoretical questions like this that we want to know down the road. So there's a lot of theory. There are a bunch of just pushing the limits of the things that we've been hearing about in the public press. Not just ChatGPT and other large language models, but image-based models and mixed multimodal language and imagery, videos, other sorts of things, making them work better. I think we all know that ChatGPT and similar things have these really famous goofs, right? They make mistakes. They're wrong sometimes. They hallucinate. If you've not heard that term, it basically saying ChatGPT or something like that will give you an answer that sounds quite plausible, and it's just completely wrong. And it's not hard to get that from ChatGPT, right? My favorite three-word response to ChatGPT is, "Are you sure?" Because almost inevitably, ChatGPT changes its mind when I ask that. and it's an example that, so, okay, this stuff that you're getting is, it's questionable. You have to validate it and stuff. So there's a lot of work just in, accuracy and things like that. There's a lot of work going on in questions of bias and possible misuse. There are applications of robotics and generative AI and other areas in generative AI. There's a lot of work, interesting work going on in applying generative AI to bioinformatics and biotechnology kinds of problems, computational biology, in protein folding and similar kinds of things. There's the innumerable applications that have hardly been tried yet that need research. And so researchers in deep learning and researchers in chemistry and materials, in climate science and all these areas are beginning to get together and push those connected areas, but still only a bit so far. So the space is just huge. There's a lot of research going on and a lot that needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you. So I warned you I was going to get back to jobs and the darker side of that question. And I'm going to put that out to the whole panel. But first, I do have my own personal story on that has a positive spin. Not that I don't want to hear the darker side of it. But I mentioned that I have my own startup this year looking at digital mental wellness through creative arts. And I started with just a skeleton crew. And basically, and I had to get back to coding myself. For one thing, ChatGPT was sort of my pair programmer next to me. And I would often put things to ChatGPT, and we'd kind of work together. There were things I had forgotten or languages I hadn't learned yet, and I could get those from ChatGPT. And I would say it even made me a better programmer, because I had to learn to frame the problem in a very logical way that I might not have done before. I might have just jumped into coding. Also, I'm an artist, but I'm not a graphic artist, and so I would have had to hire a graphic artist, and ChatGPT was creating these, beautiful icons. So that might sound like, well, I didn't hire another programmer, and I didn't hire a graphic designer. But I didn't have the funding to hire them, and my company might not have still exist if I didn't have ChatGPT and Midjourney, and now I am starting to be able to hire more people. So I would say in my case, it actually has created jobs. But I want to hear both sides of the coin, maybe, so I'm going to put that out to anyone in the panel.
Yes, Marco, I think you're right when it comes to using generative AI capabilities to assist your day in, day out work. That works very well. And there are some, there are few restrictions that a couple of, or maybe countable, companies have put in to restrict the uses of generative AI capabilities in daily job, right? Now, one thing you need to be careful, Marco, and I must say this in this full room, is that as you type in your queries to whatever model, open source model or corporate paywall kind of model that you're using, they do log the data, so they can get back to you and hunt you in later days. It's kind of like a freemium kind of thing where you get things for free and you use it, and then the other day the ad shows up on your whatever you're watching. So you got to be careful. And then there is a legit risk of kind of like these companies forcing these regulations in place for not to use these generative AI capabilities in their daily job. Is like, someone might just copy paste some code snippet from a GitHub repo and then ask this ChatGPT to do something. And in response to that, the coder or the programmer or the non-programmer might be very happy because he or she would get the results that he or she could paste it and then get it done. But in the process of doing that, there might be some instances where you can definitely leak the data out, like your subscription key or whatnot. Maybe you didn't understand something and just copy paste and thought it's okay, but in the process of doing that, you leaked out stuff. So yeah, that is something to be careful in terms of what could be the consequences.
Yeah, thank you. You reminded me of another question, but first, any other quick thoughts on jobs?
I'll say that if you look at the world of construction, it's not generally a field that leads with respect to tech adoption. It's a laggard, not a leader. And we have had plenty of people in this sector ask us, like, are you coming to take my job? And many of the people that do construction scheduling, they've been doing it for a long time. They've been using the same tools to do it, 20 years, 30 years, they've got a way of doing it. And what I can tell them honestly is, look, I don't think we're going to be necessarily taking your job, but we're going to be changing it. And for some of them, that change will be too much. And they'll say, peace out, I'm done, I've done this for 30 years, this is too much for me. But for others, it's going to be really enlightening, because what we will do is take a bunch of the drudgery and give it to the machine. Let the machine do it. They're great at handling, just crunching of information. And instead, let the people do some of the creative thinking and ask the interesting questions. What if we did this? What if we did that? And I think in that sort of situation, what we're doing is actually upgrading the nature of work.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. So Sushil reminded me about the topic of legislation and governmental oversight, and I'm going to ask about that. And in the meantime, I'll also ask if we did get some Q&A on index cards, some questions. Someone is free to drop those off with me, and I'll intersperse them. Yep. Okay, thank you. So, yeah, so I think we may be reaching this point, or it's a question at least, around regulation. There are obviously some very important industries that are highly regulated by the government, the pharmaceutical industry, the airline industry, and arguably generative AI is profoundly important in what can happen. So I know, Matthew, you've been looking at some of these issues. So what do you think should happen in terms of regulation, and probably will or will not happen?
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying I'm a big optimist in terms of these technologies. I think they have great potential to really do wonderful things that are important to humanity. But I also worry about a lot of things. And I think if we don't, as a society, get some of these things right, deal with the risks appropriately, we're going to really regret it. There's all kinds of efforts right now in terms of regulation and proposed regulation, in terms of proposed agreed upon standards and all sorts of things. It's in various aspects of AI in general. For example, face recognition, there are like local communities passing laws, there's states passing laws, there's proposed laws at the national level, there's European Union laws, there's China and other places. It's a patchwork of craziness, and in some cases they're only at, the police can't do this, or this can't be done in public, or this can't be done whatever. It's kind of a crazy landscape at the moment. It's the Wild West of regulation, I guess, or beginnings of regulation, and that's maybe to be expected. And in some cases, I think it's way too far. In some cases, I don't think it's far enough. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find some reasonable approaches where we do start with what's important here to society, what's reasonable for government to specify, what can be done voluntarily by companies and organizations, how can those things fit together, and that has happened in other areas, and so it's possible that it can. I happen to be fairly pessimistic about the likelihood of politically anything reasonable getting done in this country in the coming years, but hopefully I'm just too pessimistic and can be wrong about that. But anyway, I could go on for a long time about some of the details here, but I think there are solutions, and I think we need to have some kind of regulatory solutions. Not having them would be really problematic, I believe, for lots of reasons. And I hope we can get there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I do want to be a little provocative and dig a little deeper into that. So if we didn't have legislation, let's just talk for a few minutes. What are some of the bad things that could happen in a few years?
Yeah, so all these bad things that I or you guys might mention are going to happen. It's just presumably they'll happen less frequently if there's good regulation. So So, for example, misinformation, deep fakes, generative AI, people using generative AI to kind of do 10 times worse than what they've done with Facebook and social media in recent years in terms of sowing distrust and discord and all that kind of thing. Knowing what really gets people going and pushing those buttons in a way that just really messes up society. Those things are real possibilities, I think, with generative AI. And just sort of the loss of trust in general. An example I always think about is, probably all of you remember the bus, I forget what the show is, the bus that candidate Donald Trump, there was this video of him on a bus talking to somebody and saying things that weren't very nice before the election in 2016. And essentially, he had to say, yeah, that was me, but other sort of reasons why it was okay or whatever. Nowadays, you wouldn't even have to admit to it, ever, because it's just a deep fake. I didn't really say that. And there are all kinds of examples like this that can be problematic. So on another sort of malicious use, people using generative AI to design viruses that are going to be incredibly contagious and are going to kill people of a certain type. That's very much likely to happen, I think. And everything in between. There's all kinds of ways people can maliciously use these things. And then there's just not malicious things, but bias that exists because of the data or that a system is trained on or because of other reasons that the designers may not be thinking about, may not be obvious in how they use it or how they expect it to be used, but ends up being very damaging for certain communities or sub-communities. And there's a bunch of others, but those are a few.
Yeah. Well, I've got a whole list of questions still, but if anyone wanted to comment on that before I go.
I would say I worry a lot about the potential use of this technology by armed forces, by the military, right? Because you think about the enablement of machines to make decisions about people's lives in a combat situation, kind of setting them loose on the battlefield, could be it could change the way the world works. And that governments are working on this already worldwide. Who's going to rein that in? And just because we maybe in this country are able to get our act together and pass some legislation that drives some choices there, doesn't mean Russia's going to do it, doesn't mean China's going to do it, and so forth and so on. So in any case, I think the potential misuse within the military of this technology, I think it's huge and very problematic.
Yeah, thank you. So Matthew, you mentioned bias, and that's something we hear a lot about, and I'd like to dig into that for just a minute. So Sushil, I happen to know from when we were colleagues that you were doing some work and encountered bias and worked hard to overcome that, actually. So I do have a positive spin on this question. So what kinds of bias are out there? Like, not all of us know where that can creep in, and then what can we do to overcome that?
Yeah, that's a very good question in the era of generative AI and AI in general. There are tons of biases, like even us humans are biased in some or the other way, right? I'm biased. If you ask me what is my favorite restaurant, I'm biased, right? Because I would pick from one of those which I have visited or ate food and I really liked, right? So we all are biased in one or the other ways. And when we train these kind of AI models, and then when we curate these training data or test data, for example, we unconsciously, it's called a conformity bias, we unconsciously kind of seep our biases into these models, and that's when these models tend to be biased towards whatever the training data turns out to be. Because at the end of the day, what model is trying to do is trying to, with its number of thousands or if not millions of parameters, it's trying to fit a statistical model over the training data set, right? Once it does that, that's when you say it's training complete. Now let's do the inference or the test part and, give it out to the public or, do the alpha, beta testing, whatever. But coming down to your question, Marka, about the biases, there are different kinds of biases we can talk about. One of them is the racial bias, mostly found in the facial recognition technologies and so forth. There are gender biases, there are age biases, right? So racial biases when your training data, at the end of the day, it's like how diverse your training data set is and what you define bias as, right? Like a model that is, doing my job and, as you mentioned before, writing code for you might not be biased to you, but for someone who is, let's say, a Spanish speaker and the model is turning everything into English, that model is biased towards English, right? So every one of us has our own definition of bias, but more or less it can be broadly categorized as the racial biases where these models are performing very good for, say, lighter, especially for the facial recognition systems, right? These models would perform very good with, lighter skin tone, but then they would do bad on the darker skin tone. If you look at the Fitzpatrick's scale, 4, 5, 6, those are the relatively darker skin tone. So this model would do very bad, would not even recognize you. Right, so those kind of things are there. Then there is age biases, for example. Most of the data sets that we see, which are open sourced and people use it and take it for granted, they have a very limited representation of the age. Mostly, again, this was a study done in the facial recognition side, and I've worked that before, and when we were colleagues. So I know, a lot of these data sets were kind of heavily represent only age group of up until 30, and above 30, when you get older and older, these models will stop recognizing you because on the training set you didn't represent them well. So that's kind of a age bias. And then there are gender biases, the different types of genders are not particularly represented. It could be male heavy or female heavy, right? And for females especially, these facial recognition would kind of classify you as someone else when you wear the makeup, and then when you remove the makeup, it will classify as someone else. So those kind of biases might creep into the models.
Yeah, thank you. There were a couple audience questions, and I was wondering this too. So Matthew, you mentioned how ChatGPT gets things wrong a lot, and then all you have to do is, query, and yes, it'll apologize profusely to me when I do that. So why is that happening? Why doesn't it just check itself?
Boy, that's an interesting, long answer that I'll try to make short. So we never use the term foundation model, by the way. I just want to mention that. So everybody knows large language models, right? That's sort of, you heard that with ChatGPT from the beginning. Maybe fewer of you have heard the term foundation models. And in fact, you actually incorrectly said that ChatGPT was a large language model. It's not. It's an application built on top of a large language model, and which is a foundation model. And when you build these foundation models, which are sort of the core, language model or image model or multimodal model or whatever, you're training on huge amounts of data. You have billions of parameters. This training, takes a long time on a bunch of GPUs and hurts the environment and all this stuff, which is another whole thing we could talk about. But at the end of the day, remember what I said earlier about, theoretically we don't know that much about this space. We don't really know what it knows and what it doesn't know. We can play with it, we can poke it, we can see, and it seems to be pretty good at things. But we find when we poke it enough that it has inaccuracies, it hallucinates things, it doesn't reason properly, it performs all kinds of things. Why? We don't know why. It's just how it was trained, by the methods it was done and by the number of parameters and the choices that were made. pragmatically, sort of rather than theoretically. So there's not one clear answer to that, but it's really an indication that these things are quite opaque to us. Deep networks in general are very opaque, and we could also talk for another hour about what's the phrase? Explainable AI in general, or explainability is lacking in these things. People, unlike sort of old-fashioned AI, where you can build an expert system that would say, okay, it came to this decision because of this, and because of this, and because of this, and those things put together, and I could follow the chain of reasoning that brought me to that decision. In deep networks, we can't do that. And it's a big area of research, going back to that question, of trying to make them less opaque, more transparent, more understandable, but it's a long road to hoe to get there.
Yeah, thank you. We are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to put one more thing out there for discussion, which is about ownership of the data that's out there and how it came to be. And also this comes into play in the art world that I live in AI art. And sometimes I put this out there to kind of provoke other artists and see what comes back. So Midjourney, if you use that, you can give it prompts and you can kind of iterate on it and you can get some very beautiful artwork to come out of it. And then people post it, and some artists take the position that that's their art. And so my thesis around that I just kind of do to poke the bear, is, hundreds of years ago, artists around the time of Michelangelo, they received a lot of their money through commissions. A patron would come, paint a picture of painting of my family. They would do it. Sometimes it wasn't what they expected, so they'd give another text prompt, in a sense, to the artist. No, what I really wanted, was the lighting in this way and the couch behind us. And theoretically, that could have gone on through several iterations, and the patron changing their text prompt each time to the painter. And in no case would we ever have considered the patron to be the artist, the person coming up with the text prompts. In all cases, the painter was the artist. So I put that out there, and by the way, after we're done speaking, I welcome anyone to come in and debate me on that, and that's what I love to do. So in this general realm, there's this question of ChatGPT and Midjourney training themselves on what's on the internet. And particularly in the case of imagery, it's been posed that they're actually stealing these different artist styles. They're going through and they're taking their intellectual property and they're being trained on them. And so I put this question out there. Oh, and I'll also add, there's been talk of actually having to make payments back to the data owners. So any thoughts as we wrap this up on where this data is coming from and ownership?
Well, I'll say quickly. I think the current laws, at least in the US, do not address most of these issues. And so the real question is, what do we want it to be like? And let's then get there. But most of the discussion right now is, oh, you did something wrong. No, we didn't. And it's debating sort of, it's a meaningless discussion in a way, because it's like pretending that there are laws that don't exist right now. So I think to some degree we just need to decide what we want as a society, what we think is appropriate, who should get credit when, have some good discussion about it, some debate, and then make it law. That sounds simple, and it's really not that simple. But I find a lot of discussion about it right now just kind of pointless.
Well, I like closing on we need debate and discussion around this. So with that, I'd like to thank my panel, and then we're still going to be around a while, so you can come up and talk to us. Thanks, everyone, for coming out.
Yep. Thanks so much.